since we've been together. We had the snow sneak up on us last week, and it's good to be back in God's Word. You know, we talked about Obadiah last time we were together, or we really didn't, because we had to spend the entirety of class going back over the history of the Edomites, which is what Obadiah is prophesying about. And so tonight we'll actually be getting into the text of Obadiah, not just the text because it's only one chapter long, but we will also be looking at the fulfillment of some of the prophecies that would happen through about a 200-year period, that we would see these prophecies be fulfilled by some of the things that would happen in the Jewish world in New Testament times. I'm excited for our study and to look at some of those things. If we remember where we left off, we actually did read a couple verses from Obadiah, and we talked about some of the sections that we can break this book up into. This is the shortest of the minor prophets, as we made mention. But in verses 1 through 4, what we're talking about here is the hearts of the people. And what were their hearts filled with? Their hearts were filled with pride. We remember that this was a prideful people. We looked at the history dating back all the way to Jacob and Esau. We saw where the Edomites would settle in the high country to the south, and we would see that they would have a very difficult relationship, to say the least, and all of these nations would. And we remember that these nations were supposed to be serving God, but they chose to do other things, and they chose to believe in themselves a lot of times other than to believe in God. So we'll pick up in verse number 5 where we left off last time. And verses 5 through 9, the theme would typically be God's judgment will be completed. And let's take a look at that together. If thieves came to you, if robbers by night, oh, how well you will be ruined. Would they not steal only until they had enough? If grape pickers came to you, would they not leave some gleanings? Oh, how Esau will be searched, and his hidden treasures searched out. And we've talked about this in the past, but let's make another mention of it. When it says Esau here, it's talking about the Edomite nation as a whole. And we're going to see a mention of Jacob here in just a little bit, and that's the same thing, but for another nation. So when we see names of some of these great figures, a lot of times when we see them in formats like this, in places like this, it's not talking about the individual, it's talking about the nation that would become of their descendants. So that's just a quick thought there on that. So Esau will be searched, and his hidden treasures will be searched out. All the people allied with you will send you to the border, and the people at peace with you will deceive you and overpower you. They will eat your bread, will set an ambush for you. There is no understanding in him. So when we think about some of the stuff that we are reading here, especially here in verse 8, this is something that Israel would also fall into over the years. And in fact, we've looked at that in some of the other prophets. What did they start to do when it came to their relationship with other nations? They started believing in their diplomatic partnerships more than they believed in God. They started taking stock in what these other nations and kings were saying, and it led them down a bad path. Oftentimes, God said, don't marry these people. Don't intermarry. And they intermarried, and that would bring problems. They would bring idolatry. They would bring all of these different cultural differences that would bring the nation down. The Edomites were no different in their practice, except it was probably even more rampant throughout history. The people at peace with you will deceive you and overpower you. They believed in their relationship with others over their relationship with God. Verse number 8, I will not on that day, declares the Lord, eliminate wise men from Edom and understanding from the Mount of Esau. The Mount of Esau, as we made mention, was the land of Seir, which is the high country. Another mention there. And when we see that name thing pop up once again, as we made mention of earlier. Any questions or comments so far? There's some more meat as we get into this.
I'll tell you, folks, they hear this word, but they don't understand the word. That the last, God is the last, or Jesus is the last, but he's the first. And it says that they'll not understand what he speaks. And
so these are people without understanding. You know,
yes.
maybe some of them potentially are looking for a way, but they are led by their own desires, like sometimes we are today. They're led away into those things. So it's something definitely to consider. Once we get to verse number 10, we start to see a little bit of a shift in Obadiah's writing. And he goes from all of these accusations about what is going on with the nation. Here in verses 5 through 9, the judgment will be complete. God's judgment will be complete against the people. But verses 10 through 14, we really start to get the why. Ari?
Before we take off into that, I think, pick up where James was talking about, I mean, you see in verse 8, that they're even going to destroy the wise men of Edom. So that's what happens. We think we become too smart. We get too smart for our own britches, as we say sometimes. And that creates the pride in us that we no longer need God. And if you go down to the next verse, they're talking about the mighty men. Oh, I got mighty men and warriors. We can take care of ourselves. They planted themselves on a high mountain. And look at us. We did this.
And that's a great point. And we're going to see this in the sins that are brought against the people here. Exactly all that entails in that high and mighty mentality that we even can struggle with today. This isn't something that is just specific to these people, and especially with those who are going to perish, as we just had made mention. You think about the biblical principle of being wise in your own eyes, right? You know, we know that's something that we read in the text, being wise in your own eyes. Now, is that wisdom of man or wisdom of God? That's the wisdom of man talking right there. You think about Solomon, who was the wisest in the world, but his wisdom, especially early on, was not the wisdom of God, was it? It was the wisdom of man. And it took him years and years to see that the things of this world could not satisfy his desires, and it took him to the end of his life. And we read that. We can read about that in Ecclesiastes and other places as well, and we've talked about that in the past. But we have to make sure that our wisdom comes from above and is not the conventional wisdom of man. That's what the Edomites were doing as well. So let's pick back up. Talk about the warriors there in verse 9. Verse number 10. Here's some of the reasons. Let's get into them. Because of the violence to your brother Jacob, shame will cover you, and you will be eliminated forever. So that's the first detail of this prophecy. Notice this. You will be eliminated forever. There is no Edomites today. And we're going to look at some of the how God went about accomplishing this prophecy here in just a little bit. But that's just the fact of the matter. There will be no more Edomites, and they will be eliminated forever. On that day, you stood aloof. On that day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates. The first one we see is the violence towards your brother. The second one that we see in this passage so far, verses 10 through 14, I would say is the sin of omission. So typically when we think about sins, we put them in several different categories. A sin of commission or a sin of omission. So what are they omitting? Well, the Edomites saw their brothers being attacked by other nations. And what did they do? They just stood and watched. They were content from their high places. They did nothing. They did nothing to help them. So the first sin that we see is the sin of omission here. But it doesn't stop there, unfortunately, for the Edomites, because, let's continue. You stood aloof, and on that day that strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates, and cast lots for Jerusalem. You were as one of them. Notice this in verse 12. Do not gloat over your brother's day, the day of his misfortune, and do not rejoice over the sons of Judah on the day of their destruction. Yes, do not boast on the day of their distress. So we see another one here that is made mention of. Boasting about other people's downfall, to say the least, is not a godly attitude. And we see this today as well. And we see people who we may be thinking, well, why are they doing well in life? Or why is God blessing them in this way? And we see something bad happen to them, and it's easy for us, if our heart's not in the right place, to say, yeah, that's what should happen. But that's not what we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to have a heart like that. And so we should never boast or be happy about the downfall of other people. And here's the Edomites. They're gloating. They're excited. They say, look at these people who claim that, they've got God on their side. This is what they deserve. Instead of being joint together and acting as family should and as brothers should, they preyed on their downfall. Notice this. Let's get back to it. Down here in verse 13, do not enter the gate of my people on the day of their disaster. You indeed do not gloat over their catastrophe on the day of their disaster. And do not lay a hand on their wealth on the day of their disaster. Do not stand at the crossroads to eliminate their survivors, and do not hand over their refugees on the day of their distress. We remember a couple weeks ago when we looked at this, whenever the Babylonian captivity was taking place, the Edomites were literally handing over the captives to the Babylonians. They weren't just, as we talked about the sin of omission, it wasn't just that. They also had the sin of commission. They actively did something that was wrong in the eyes of God towards their brother. It wasn't just the sin of standing back and not helping them, as we can fall into sometimes. When we see somebody drop something at the grocery store and we're thinking, should I help them or not? Well, it's probably good to go ahead and help them. That'd be just, I guess, very basic idea of the sin of omission, where we omit, we do not do something that we should do. And that's something that we need to be aware of as well. But also the sin of commission, which we are well aware of when we know something is wrong and we decide to do it anyway. They did that to their brother. Any comments? Here in verse 15, we start to see another shift of the sand, so to speak. It's talking about the coming and the near day of the Lord that is going to be upcoming. And we can get into the details, and we will, about what that entitled for them. And whenever we see the day of the Lord, as we looked at in our last book study, it just typically will mean the day of judgment. And it doesn't have to be the day of judgment where we are all judged for the things that we do. It can be a day of judgment. And some of these people that we have read about have gone through multiple days of the Lord, even in their lifetime, as we read about in Joel. But here in this one, it's talking about something that would happen in the future. Notice this in verse 15. For the day of the Lord is near for all the nations. That's important. That gives us at least an idea about the time that this would take place. I believe this carries implications that would carry into the New Testament, which we'll discuss here in just a moment. For all nations, just as you have done, it will be done to you. That's a problem, isn't it? Because what have we just been discussing that they had done? They had omitted their brother. They failed to help them. They sinned against them. They took what was theirs. They did all of these things that were wrong in God's sight, as well as not keeping a covenant with Him. They didn't care about that. As we've discussed in other prophets, they knew who God was, but they didn't have a relationship with Him. They failed to do that. So as the day of the Lord is coming, and here Obadiah says, as you have done, it shall be done to you. That's not a good thing if you're an Edomite. That is not what you want to hear if you're an Edomite. In other words, for us today, why should we expect God's mercy if we don't give mercy to others?
We won't have His mercy if we don't. If you do to the least of these, you've done for me. If you haven't, then you haven't forgotten.
That's exactly right. Paul?
We read, I think a Sunday or two ago, that talking about treating the widows and the orphans, and he says, if you don't treat them well, you shall, you will be killed, and your wife will be a widow, and your children will be orphans. So you treat the widows and the children, the orphans, well, or this will happen to you. It's that same idea.
It is the same idea. And there's both, and we've talked about this before, yes.
I was going to say in the King James, the end of that verse says, thy reward shall return upon thine own head. Makes me think, you reap what you sow.
I should have gotten it in the verse. Here in the New American Standard, it says, your dealings will return on your own head. And I like that translation in the King James there. It's gonna come back to you. We have the, I guess, worldly idea of karma that we talk about sometimes. That's not necessarily a biblical word or anything, but whenever you do bad things to others, it's not going to be good for you. Paul?
I think of Mordecai and Haman and all that, and here he builds this tower to hang him, and he's hung on that tower. So be careful don't curse someone else, because what you're cursing may be coming to you.
Also, you think about the idea, to build upon that, of fruits. You can bear good fruit, but you can also bear bad fruit. And it's not necessarily a question of if you'll bear fruit, but will it be good or bad? And, we read in the New Testament different things about, bitter water and fresh water. They can't come from the same place. For us as Christians, we have to be consistent, especially when considering some of these factors about it will be done to us how we do to others. Any other comments on this?
Galatians 6. Go ahead.
Everything that's done is already written. There's no way that we can mess it up as a human. It is already written. We can think that we're messing up in one way and try to change it, but God already knows the hairs that's counted on our head and what's going to happen tomorrow. And His plan is already, He said, fight the good fight, for the battle's already won. So there's no argument with any of it. We can come against or collaborate or whatever with all these verses, but He's the boss, and He's done got it written.
And you're exactly right about that. I mean, what God has spoken, we have in our hands, and we got to take advantage of that. We've got to be in His Word. We've got to be in the Scriptures, and they're settled, because that's what God has said. When we read things like what we're reading here in Obadiah, we can look at the examples of those that have come before us and try to avoid making the same mistakes. It's a great guide for us on how to avoid some of those problems in life and some of the sins that they would commit and that they would have issues in their life. Any other comments before we continue? All right, so
Say to be at liberty and come as you are. Just be yourself. And God's glory is within what we call bad or good. Everything is fulfillment. Is not no man's glory, not even Jesus. It's God's glory. He sent His only begotten Son, which is Jesus, and He's His. He's His.
I got what you're saying. No worries.
Yes, there's no words to explain Him, and He's from A to Z. He's from start to the end. There's no way we can mess it up, but we can give God glory.
We can give Him the
That's all
glory,
we
and
can
we
do.
should as well. It's definitely something that we're required to do. Okay, so back to Obadiah, verse number 15. Let's pick up at the end of that verse 15. Your dealings will return on your own head, for just as you drank on my holy mountain, all the nations will drink continually. They will drink to the last drop. Notice that. There'll be nothing left. They'll drink to the last drop there in verse number 16, and become as if they had never existed. But on Mount Zion there will be those who escape, and it will be holy, and the house of Jacob will possess their property. Verses 17 through 20, we start to see God will use Israel to bring this judgment. He is going to use the nation that has been beaten and battered by the people who is having this judgment poured out against them to make it happen. Which is interesting when considering the fact that what has God just said about this? Well, He said what you have done to them will be done to you. And so the fact that He's using His nation to do this, and we'll look at how He does that here in just a moment, I think is very significant to our conversation. Okay, so the house of Jacob will possess their property. Then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame. But the house of Esau will be like stubble, and they will set them on fire and consume them, so that there will be no survivor in the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. Okay, so there's two different events that I think of when I think about what we've just read there, especially about the fire. this would be one that would happen after the death of Christ, that we would see later on. And we'll get into that. I don't want to give it away just yet. But there's also another event that would happen that God would use the Jews to make this happen. Let's continue, and then we'll get into some of that extra history there. Down here in verse number 18, there will be no survivor left in the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. Verse 19, then those of the Negev, some of your translations probably have a different form of that word there as well. Here in the NASB it is Negev, will possess the mountain of Esau, and those of the Shephelah, the Philistine plain, and also those will possess the territory of Ephraim and the territory of Samaria, and Benjamin, the territory of Gilead. There's a common theme about all of these peoples and nations that are just mentioned right there, and that is that they are typically the least of the people that are around. And I think that's significant because here are these people who think that they're high and mighty, that they're above reproach or above correction, the Edomites, and what is God going to use? He's going to use the least to conquer them, the least that will inhabit their land when the time is done. And I think I had some other information I wanted to bring out about the Negev is another one, Paul.
And you'd mentioned there would not be any remaining from the house of Esau, but if we go back, and this is in 1 Kings chapter 11, about verse 17 or so, we have David and Joab and Israel going up to fight against Edom, and it says that for 6 months did Joab remain there with all of Israel until he had cut off every male in Edom. Now this is the first, one of the first fights Israel with Edom, with the Edomites. And you would think, okay, if he cut off every male, how are there any more left? Well, if remember, we have Hadad had left, he was of the Edomites, left, went to Egypt, and it says, and some of the Edomites with him. And so then he stays in Egypt for a while until David and Joab die, and he asks Pharaoh if he could take his leave, and he comes back, and it says, he was a thorn in the side, my words, a thorn in the side of Solomon all of his days. And so, but that kind of brings us why we still have some Edomites to be destroyed, because you would think here if every male was killed, how would there be any? But some of them had left and went to Egypt and have come back.
And that's great history leading up to what makes this happen. I appreciate you bringing that out. The Negev that we read there is a dry and desolate area of Canaan. It was promised to Israel. And what's interesting about it is Saul and David were the ones to really conquer that area. And it's known for being a dry and desolate place. Really, nobody wanted to live there. There were some nomads that would travel through there that you can read about in history. But it wasn't a great place. And so, once again, another example of God using, these people who are not very much numerically, and they're not very much as a nation, to come in and inhabit this land of these people who thought they were great. So, we got a little bit more to go through. So how does God use Israel to do this? Paul has just made mention that all of this had to happen just so there were Edomites to destroy. And we see this through some of the interesting parts of Jewish history. So, about 100 years or so, yes?
So question, so the Edomites, are they Israel? Or...
They are not in Israel. No, they live in an adjacent land. They are kin to Israel, though. They are the descendants of Esau, and then Jacob would go on to become the Israelites.
How can the Edomites be destroyed and Israel still live?
Well,
and then say that there's nothing left when it sounds like the Edomites are Israel.
We'll get into that here in just a moment. So, about 100 years or so before Jesus came, there was a man that would be a part of what we will call the Herodian dynasty that leads into Christ's narratives. His name was John Hyrcanus, and he was a Jewish priest. He was a military leader as well that would lead them to be free from, he himself would not do this. It would already be established by some of his forefathers. But he would lead them in what we know as the Maccabean revolt. It was something that happened. They would revolt against the Seleucids, the Greeks, and it would be a big event in Jewish history. That's where Hanukkah comes from, the Maccabean Revolt. Lots of interesting history components there. But here's something that's interesting. In the Greek, turn with me over to Mark chapter 3. The Edomites are still around, although not very much numerically, in the book of Mark. Notice this in verse number 8 of Mark chapter 3. There in verse number 8. And from Jerusalem and from Idumea. Now we would typically just read right over that word, but that is actually the Greek word that's used for the Edomites. So they're still around. And this is significant for several reasons. So, when John Hyrcanus comes in, he is one of the only exceptions in Jewish history where he forces these Edomites to convert. He goes in and conquers them about 100 BC, and he forces them to accept circumcision. Now, this would be important whenever it came to the time of Jesus, because it actually has a lot of interesting historical components to it. So he comes in, he forces the Edomites to accept circumcision. They do. When you come to Jesus' day, here's something that's interesting. You see the Herods were descendants from Edom. Now that's something that is kind of a shocker to us, because the Herods, and we're talking about the kings that were there at the time, they actually are descendants, and we see I think it is, Herod the Great, Antipater, was from Idumea. We can see that in another piece of scripture, and we also have some other historical evidence for that. So he was from there, and here's another interesting tidbit about it. Herod the Great was married to John Hyrcanus' granddaughter. Can't you see how the Herods were manipulating the political system at the time, because he thought that gave him a greater, I guess, identity when it came to being a Jewish ruler at the time. So, who is that? That's the same Herod that in Matthew chapter 2 had the plot to kill Jesus. So, can't we see how all of this is starting to work together to put the people in power? God is using these Jews to go into place, to go and have this go into action for the Edomites to be destroyed. Now, it's a very long process of this happening over the course of several hundred years. And so what we end up seeing happening with the Idumeans at this point is around 68 or 69 AD, the Romans come through, and since they have accepted circumcision, by this time they're completely lumped in with the Jews, and they completely wipe them out. They completely destroy them. And so in 69 or 60, about 68 or 69, we see these people were completely wiped off the earth. They had still inhabited the land. Some of them had moved to other places since they had accepted circumcision. And so God was using all of these components and all of the political, different aspects of the day to accomplish His will. Something that I find just fascinating. And we see the ties that John Hyrcanus' granddaughter strengthened his, claim to the throne, which the Herods were very corrupt, as we studied in New Testament as well. Any thoughts on some of these historical components? And then we've got a few applications to make.
Say again, what happened in 68?
In 68 or so, when we see the Romans really start to push their military campaign, the one that would eventually end in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, they first started taking out the territories surrounding Jerusalem. Now, they took them out in about 68 or 69, and there was just simply none left at that point. We have some Roman writings, and if you're ever interested in some of that information, I can get some of it to you that talk about the military campaigns and where they were when. And so about around that time period is when they completely wiped what was left of the Edomites off the map, finally fulfilling this prophecy fully that we read about in Obadiah. Any other comments, questions?
So how vain were the Edomites within the circumcision? Was it celestial circumcision of the soul, or was it the physical body?
This was the physical circumcision that the Jews were imposing at the time. It was still under the law at this time, so they were still bound by circumcision. And so the Edomites, whenever John Hyrcanus comes in and he tells them you have to accept circumcision, which would be a theme with the Jews in even Jesus' time. We remember whenever we see the New Testament and we see the New Covenant, what was it that the Judaizers were trying to do to the Greeks, to the Gentiles? Well, they were trying to force circumcision, physical circumcision on them.
Okay.
But in the New Testament, obviously, God is worried about the circumcision of the heart, as you were speaking to.
That's what
Yes.
That's what I was getting to right there. You don't have to be physically clean because he said like your hands. It's not what goes in; it's what comes out.
Yes.
It's your the physical condition of your soul is what will save you. It's not your body.
That's exactly right. So that was a difference from the old law to the new. We don't have to worry about that today. It's a matter of the heart and being right with God. So I appreciate you bringing that out. Any other comments or questions about? Yes.
I think it's interesting. The word gloat that's used in verse 12 and 13 is very interesting. I've just searched it up here in my Logos app, and that Hebrew word is used 2,049 times through the Bible, but only twice is it translated as gloat, and that's in Obadiah 12 and 13. But it's interesting. Almost every other time it's used, it's translated as look or see or inspect. But if you look through some of these verses that use that word, it's almost always in seeing something that's very positive or joyful. So it's interesting that word translated as gloat here means to see something and take joy.
That's,
Which is, in the New King James, it's gazed, which, if you're gazing at something, it's more of a
positive.
if something has your gaze, it captures your gaze. It has that implication. That's a good point as well. So I think that's very interesting, and I think that really just shows that they were looking upon what was happening, and they were glad that it was happening. And it's bad to wish that upon anybody.
You made some comments about circumcision, physical, and of the heart. It's interesting that we have another prophet who mentions those same words. Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 26. Egypt and Judah and Edom and the children of Ammon and Moab, and are all in the uttermost corners that dwell in the wilderness, for all of these nations are uncircumcised, and all the house of Israel are uncircumcised in the heart. Israel was circumcised in the body. They weren't circumcised in the heart at that point. They were serving other gods.
And that's the whole full circle that we see run into there. A couple lessons from Obadiah as we start to sum it up. I think that we can understand, for one, we see this in verses 1 and 21, that God is sovereign. He is over all. He is in control. And that's something that we understand fundamentally for ourselves. The second is we see in really verses 3 and 4 in the undertone of what Obadiah is talking about, pride definitely does come before the fall. You can't be prideful and inherit the kingdom of heaven. It's just something that is opposed to what God wants for us. The third would be that God cares how we treat other people. I think of Galatians chapter 6, verse number 10. So then while we have the opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who were of the household of faith. The Edomites definitely did not take advantage of that, did they? They definitely did not treat well their brother in this circumstance, and unfortunately they had to pay in eventually being completely wiped out of the earth as an entire nation. That's crazy for us to think about, but that is the case. And also I'll say this, that we definitely reap what we sow. Something that we have to consider as well. Any other comments or things that you think of?
I know we have references to the different prophets that are giving the same prophecy, and if you look at Jeremiah and Ezekiel it kind of gives you a feeling of what God's going to do. It says, "And I will lay my vengeance upon Edom by the hand of my people Israel, and they shall do unto Edom according to mine anger and according to my fury, and they shall know my vengeance, saith the Lord." So vengeance belongs to who? Saith the Lord. It's mine. And so he says, they're going to know my vengeance. It's time. It's time to repay.
Tucker, do we have an invitation song? 963 will be our invitation song. Any other thoughts as we conclude? I appreciate all the comments. Obadiah is an interesting study. When seeing people who are struggling with pride, isn't that a problem in our society today? You know, we have people today who are not just, I've committed sin, but they're prideful about it. They have pride about the sin that they commit, and we know from the Bible that this isn't a comparable attitude with people who have a right relationship with God, and so we have to make sure that we're not prideful people, at least not in the same ways that we read about here with the attitudes of these people. We have to make sure that our hearts are circumcised, as we have made mention of tonight, that our hearts are in the right place with God and that we have that relationship with Him. We can't let pride destroy us, and we can't be overcome with it. We have to make sure that we have a healthy relationship with our pride, and we can't be using it for things that God would not want. We cannot, now at the same time, what was it that Paul said? Am I ashamed of the gospel? No. We can be prideful in a way of what the Lord has done for us, but we should only boast in Jesus Christ. We can't boast in things that we have done, in our own accomplishments. We can't get salvation for ourselves. It's not something we can earn. All the glory goes to God, as we've made mention to tonight. So, if we're struggling, if we're hurting tonight, we want you to know that we're praying for you, that we love you, and that at this time, as we offer this invitation, it's an opportunity to make things right, regardless of what's going on in your life. God wants you, He loves you, and He'll always welcome you back. So if you're struggling tonight, we'd love to offer that to you. And if there's any other thing that you need, it's always a great opportunity. If you've not yet become a Christian, we'd also love to study with you about that. If there's anything you need at all, please consider coming us together. We'll stand and sing.